We'll be picking up where we left off in chapter 21 at verse 17. And been a couple of weeks, and we been looking at the various places that the Apostle Paul has been on his way back to Jerusalem, and everywhere he stops, he's being warned that and told there's going to be trouble when you get there. And yet he continues his journey, knowing full well that he's going to face these things. And we had talked about how, once it had been revealed to the brethren along the way that they tried to talk him out of going. But he basically tells them, I've got to go. And that the things that he's being told were not going to deter him, but were going to help him prepare for what was ahead, is basically what was taking place. And so we pick up at verse 17. And when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When we had greeted them, he told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said to him, You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Okay, so we'll pause there for a few moments and take a look at this. So they finally have arrived at Jerusalem. And it says the first place they go is to see James. All right. Who was James? Brother of Jesus. Remember, James the apostle had been killed by Herod. And so this is the brother of Jesus that they are going to see, and the elders are there with them. And so you kind of get the idea that, word's gotten around that Paul's here and he's going to go see James tomorrow. And so all of the elders go so that they can be there and talk to him about the situation. And so the Apostle Paul, as a part of the conversation, goes over everything that's been happening among the Gentiles. How the Gentiles are coming to Christ, how they're leaving behind the idolatry. And I'm sure he also talks about the problems he's run into with some of the Gentiles, but also with the Jews. And it says that when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And keep in mind, this is a change for the Jews, that now the Gentiles are welcome. We saw early on where they kind of questioned things, especially when Peter had gone to Cornelius' house and he came back to Jerusalem. They said, "What did you think you were doing? You went into the house of a Gentile." And Peter said, "Well, hang on a minute. Let me tell you what happened." And so at that point, they start becoming open to the fact that the Gentiles are now welcome. And so Paul comes back and he gives them a report of everything that's been going on, how the Gentiles are coming to Christ, and how the gospel is spreading across the known world. And they glorify God. And then they also follow it up with, even the Jews are coming to Christ here. In other words, You're not the only one who is having success with the gospel. It is continuing to grow here. It is continuing to have an impact here. So that even at the place where the gospel was first being preached, even though it faced a lot of struggles among the Jews, many of the Jews are believing and coming to Christ. And I'm sure for the Apostle Paul that was encouragement too, because we read in Romans that he's concerned for his fellow Jews, that they're not coming to Christ like they should be. And his prayer is that at some point they will all finally get it, so to speak, and come to Christ. And so I'm sure that this was an encouragement to him, to hear that, yes, the Jews, many of the Jews are accepting the gospel. But keep in mind, it's not the elite for the most part. We do see some along the way here and there. We saw the synagogue ruler and so on. But for the most part, the Jewish elite, especially in Jerusalem, are still absolutely opposed to the gospel. And for the same reasons that we have looked at before. They're jealous. They don't want anybody else to take their place as leaders spiritually among the people. And so they see the apostles and the spread of the gospel as being a threat to their authority. I mean, that even goes back into the time of Christ, because remember, one of the questions that Jesus was asked, by what authority are you doing these things? Because they had this process. You were not qualified to be a rabbi or teacher unless you had gone through their school and been approved by them, and then you had authority to speak. And obviously, the apostles didn't go to that school. Of course, they got one problem. Paul did. He studied under Gamaliel. And there are times he uses that as his defense for his understanding of the Scriptures, that he studied under Gamaliel. And remember, we found out earlier, Gamaliel was one of the really what was the word I was looking for? Had it on the tip of my tongue and it disappeared. One of the highly respected teachers. He's the one that got up and talked to them and convinced them to just simply give the apostles a warning that if it was from God, you couldn't stop it. And if it's not from God, it'll fizzle out on its own. So he's a respected teacher, and he's a wise man. And so the Apostle Paul does not fit in the same paradigm as the apostles. The apostles did not study at that school. Paul did. And he, like I said, he uses that at many times as a defense for his position in teaching and preaching and trying to bring the Jews to a better understanding. And so, hearing that his fellow Jews, many of them are converting to Christianity, would have been an encouragement to him. Because his arrival in Jerusalem right now is probably after he had sent that letter to the Romans, to the Roman church, expressing his concern for his fellow Jews. And so there's that encouragement that even here the gospel is still continuing to spread, but we got a little bit of a problem with you, Paul. Not per se with you, but we've got this rumor going around that you're telling the Jews that you basically can't be Jews anymore, that you're to abandon your heritage and all of this stuff. And we want you to basically make peace by showing that you as a Jew do still observe the law. And here's how we want you to do that. And they lay out this process. Now keep in mind, the Jews were expected to still observe the law. There would have been one exception to the observance of the law. What would that have been for the Jews? Yeah, no longer a need for them to offer sacrifices. That sacrifice had been made, but everything else, the festivals, the feasts, and all of the other things, that was a part of their heritage. And they were to continue to remember that. They were to continue to hang on to that connection to their past. Of course, the hope was that that connection to their past would help open the door to them accepting the gospel as they began to understand how their past and everything that was taking place was for the purpose of bringing Christ into the world. And everything in their past that's connected through these feasts, and we've kind of touched on it before, it's been quite a while, how these feasts were fulfilled in Christ. The hope would be that they would finally realize that by keeping that connection. And we see in this passage that apparently there are many that are making that connection. They are beginning to understand that He is the Messiah. He is the one that was prophesied. I mean, to basically, for the most part, sit down to a Gentile and go back through the Old Testament prophecies per se wouldn't have the same kind of connection for them as it would for the Jews. Because those prophecies are an integral part of their heritage. Those prophecies are part of a promise that was being made to them from the very beginning. And more than likely, part of what it would be causes them to struggle with it is the fact that they've been viewing it as a promise specifically to them, and yet now the Gentiles are being welcomed in. Even though God promised through Abraham that everyone would be blessed, not just the Jews. Interesting how when we get focused on ourselves, we tend to miss the whole picture. We tend to focus on that one part that seems to fit our paradigm, and we miss the rest of it, so to speak. Yeah, selective hearing, selective reading. I mean, I've been guilty of this. How about you? You're struggling with something, and you go through and you start looking for verses that support you. We find the verse, but we don't read the verses before or after to make sure that the way we understand the verse is in the proper context. And there's a lot of times that when we understand the verse in the proper context, all of a sudden it doesn't even apply to our situation at all. But it made us feel good at the time. And so we're guilty of doing the same types of things quite often. And so they're selectively understanding the prophecies. The Messiah is sent for the Jews. He's going to come and he's going to establish the Jews as the preeminent kingdom. The kingdom is going to dominate the world, and they don't understand that the kingdom that's being talked about is a spiritual kingdom. And that's one of the reasons the Apostle Paul, when he writes to the Romans, is trying to explain to them how the Gentiles are brought in and engrafted with the Jews so that on a spiritual level, they're still hanging on to their identity as a people, but on a spiritual level, as far as their relationship to God, there's no longer Jew or Gentile. Even to the extent that in the letter to the Galatians, Paul refers to the church as being God's new Israel, because now Israel includes the Gentiles. And so these are things that the Jews would have been struggling with, the things that would have been kind of, you might say, a roadblock for them. And part of what the elders are wanting Paul to do is help them get beyond that, by helping them understand that they're not being expected to leave behind their heritage. They're not being expected to leave behind that connection. That yes, they will still observe the feasts. They will still observe the various holidays and things like that were set aside, so that they remember where they were and where they are now. And the thing would be that for the Jews especially, that should become even more vivid. We talk about where we were and where we are. And for them, they have a literal heritage of being in slavery and then being brought out. And now Christ has come and has brought the ultimate freedom from slavery to sin. And so that connection, in many ways, should have been even more vivid to them because of their connection to their history through the rituals and the feasts and things like that. And so they want Paul to show that in no way is he telling the Jews that they are to abandon the law that they are to stop observing the festivals and all of these things by going through the purification process. The very fact that the Apostle Paul has arrived when he has, and why he has, is a confirmation that he is still observing the law. Because he said, I want to be there for what? The Feast of Pentecost. He is observing the law simply by making sure he was there. And so they have these 4 men who have taken a vow, and one of the signs at that time of taking a vow is you would shave your head, and then once the period for the completion of the vow was over with, then you would go and you would announce this is the end, this is the final days, and at that point a sacrifice would be offered, or an offering. I'm forgetting, not a sacrifice, an offering of some type, usually a monetary offering of some kind. And so they're telling him, go through this process so that the Jews will know that the rumors going around about you are not true. There'd be 2 reasons why they would be concerned that this rumor be dispelled. What do you think they would be? Yeah, one would be to prevent division in the church. And the second, well, if we can get the Jews to understand you're not anti-Jew, now where is he? He's in Jerusalem. We may not have a commotion. Because remember, what happens everywhere Paul goes? Trouble. So if we can convince them that you are not teaching against the law, then we might not have trouble here. But guess what? We pick up at verse 27. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Okay, let's go ahead and stop there. Doesn't matter what they do, there's going to be trouble. And notice, in this particular case, the trouble comes about because they are assuming. Okay? They're from Asia, the Jews from Asia. They're assuming that because they had seen this Ephesian with Paul in the city that he had brought him into the temple. They totally ignored what was actually going on. Why is Paul in the temple? Why is he there? He's fulfilling the purification process along with these other 4 men. If they would stopped long enough to take a look at what was actually going on, they would realize that their accusations were false. But they're making assumptions. And one of the things we noted about the Jews is they're driven by emotion. Remember, how did Peter get to the Jews when he was preaching? He went after their emotions. The Apostle Paul was the ideal person to go to the Greeks because he had the ability to reason logically. And so we see that typically what happens if you want to get the Jews stirred up, you start playing on their emotions, you start getting them believing that something about their heritage, about them as a people is being opposed, being torn apart, or whatever. And notice what they focus on. He teaches all men everywhere against the people. What's he saying? He's anti-Jew. Against the people, the law. He's anti-Moses. And this place. He's anti-temple. All right? And then they accuse him of bringing the Greeks into the temple, which they never saw. They only made the assumption because they had seen the guy in the city talking to him. And so they do what they are very good at doing, and that is stirring up fellow Jews with half-truths and out-and-out lies. And so what you've got going on is the very thing they were trying to prevent by having Paul go to the temple. You've now got a riot beginning in Jerusalem, of all places. Because Jerusalem, like Philippi, has a very, very large Roman presence. Not just because it is a strategic location, but because it is historically, as we would put it, the capital city of the Jews. And so if you are trying to maintain control over your vast empire, where do you put your forces? In the capital cities where the most influence is at. You make your presence known. That way, if there's anything going on, you make an example of those in the capital city. In other words, you make an example of the leaders of the nation. And so they have got that very large Roman presence. Remember, Christ was taken into the praetorium. They had a specific place where Pilate held court out on the steps. And so you have this riot in the works, so to speak, as they are stirring people up. And without even trying to find out if anything was true, they're trying to get rid of him. Have you noticed that along the way? The Jews are constantly trying to circumvent a trial. Why would that be? Yeah, there's also another reason. If you have a trial, you have to present the true evidence. It's kind of hard to go into a trial and accuse someone if you can't prove what you're saying is true. So what do? Well, let's hurry up, get everybody stirred up, let's lynch him and be done with it, and we don't have to have a trial. And he's gone. And so that's what is taking place. They've now drug him out of the temple, shut the doors so nobody could go in. And we pick up at verse 31. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. A polite way of saying riot, okay? He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and he asked who he was and what he had done. And some of the multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him." Okay, so we'll pause there for a moment. So we're getting an idea of just, this is a riot, okay? And these people are in such a frenzy, they don't even care that the soldiers are there. They want Paul dead. And they are risking military retribution trying to get to him. I mean, think about it. You've got, it says he ran down with the soldiers and centurions. When you've got centurions coming in, what's that tell you? You've got a lot of soldiers. Centurions commanded 100 soldiers. And so he's got these centurions and those under them coming in. So you've got a lot of military here. Armed. Getting Paul out of the middle of this, and they are still trying to get to Paul. They don't care that the military is there. They are willing to risk Rome, you might say, just turning around and killing them all to stop the riot. They have reached that point in the frenzy to where the reality of their situation doesn't matter. Because the reality is, when you've got a Roman commander working to get someone to safety so that he can find out what's going on, and you are trying to overpower his soldiers, I'll be honest, I believe God was at work here, because the normal thing that would have happened would be the commander would have basically told the soldiers, turn around, deal with it. But if they had done that, the things that followed afterward would not have taken place. And one of the things that was going to be necessary is for Paul to give his testimony, which is going to be coming up in the next chapter. Exactly. You know, he's always been in control. And in this case, whether the Jews realized it or not, he was protecting them. Because they had truly brought this to a situation where under normal circumstances, the Romans would have simply said, okay, we're done with this. And they would have made an example out of Jerusalem. And what the Romans would typically do, they wouldn't have just gone after the rioters. They would have cleaned house. They would have drug out all of the city officials, whether they were involved or not. They would have drugged them out, and everyone would have been executed. Those that did not die by the sword in the process of putting down the riot would have been drug out the city gate and crucified. As an example to anyone coming in or going out of the city. This is what happens when you start a riot. This is what happens when you defy Rome. And that was their general practice. Along the main avenues coming into any given city, you would find the crosses where people had been crucified as an example. The other thing I think we see in this commander is that he wants to find the truth. I mean, keep in mind, a lot of the Roman military commanders were corrupt. Okay? And and many of them, it would have been very easy for someone in the crowd to slip him a few coins and he'd look the other way. But this commander shows that he's got some integrity. He wants to know the truth of what's going on, to find out if this person really does need to be dealt with. And try and picture in your mind these people pressing against the soldiers, trying to get to Paul, so much so that they have to hold him up and carry him in. Okay. I mean, we kind of see that at concerts and sports things. This was for his safety. This wasn't just to have fun. This was to try and get Paul in safely so he could be questioned, so they could find out what was really going on. Does Paul need to be the one punished, or do we need to go out and start going after the people? What do we need to do? And so we've got a Roman commander who has some integrity. And in spite of what's going on, he's going after the truth instead of just going into a military response mode, which says a lot for his restraint. Because at this point in time, most commanders would have just simply put the riot down. No questions asked. But we don't see that taking place. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. Well, I think we are close enough time-wise that we'll go ahead and end there for today. And we'll pick up at verse 37. And that will probably take us into chapter 22 next week.